The morning of February 14th, 1943, began with the kind of cold clarity that made the Tunisian desert look almost beautiful. Colonel Fritz Bayerlein stood beside his command vehicle on a ridge overlooking the Kasserine Pass and watched the American positions through his field glasses. The lenses were Zeiss, ground in Jena, the finest optics in the world. Through them, the enemy looked exactly as he had expected: scattered, confused, amateur. Bayerlein had seen real soldiers break under German armor. He had watched Polish cavalry charge panzers with sabers in 1939, brave men doing an impossible thing with the wrong tools. He had stood on the ridgeline at Sedan in May 1940 and observed French colonial troops throw down their rifles and run before a single German tank had crossed the Meuse. He had ridden with Rommel across the western desert, had learned to read a battlefield the way a sailor reads weather, in the color of dust and the spacing of vehicles and the particular silence that precedes disaster. What he saw below him through those Zeiss lenses was not a defensive line. It was a collection of anxious men who had read about war in manuals and were now discovering that manuals left certain things out. The American Second Corps had arrived in North Africa with equipment that was, by most measures, adequate. Their M4 Sherman tanks were reliable and mechanically sound. Their artillery pieces were competent. Their rifles were excellent. But equipment was the smallest part of what made an army, and Bayerlein knew this better than most. He had spent 3 years watching the Wehrmacht demonstrate the difference between an army that possessed weapons and an army that understood war. The attack began at 6 in the morning. The 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions moved through the pre-dawn darkness with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this before, in Poland, in France, in the vast emptiness of the Russian steppe. Radio communications were crisp and precise. Unit commanders knew their objectives without needing to be reminded. The coordination between armor and infantry and artillery was not choreographed from above, but felt, internalized through years of shared experience. The American response was everything Bayerlein had anticipated. Forward positions collapsed within the first 90 minutes. Not because the American soldiers were cowards. Bayerlein was careful about that word, had learned in Russia that courage was distributed fairly evenly among human beings, regardless of nationality. The Americans who held their positions that morning died holding them. He could see their dead through the field glasses, arranged in the postures of men who had not run. But the units behind them received no coherent orders. Reserves that should have moved to plug gaps sat in place waiting for instructions that never arrived. Artillery that should have been ranging on the advancing panzers fired sporadically, without coordination, shells falling in patterns that suggested calculation errors rather than tactical intent. He lowered his field glasses and turned to his adjutant, Hauptmann Werner Kessler, a precise young man from Munich who had been with him since Tobruk. "They fight like they are reading from a script," Bayerlein said, "and someone has given them the wrong pages." Kessler smiled at this, the polite smile of a staff officer who recognizes that his commander has said something that will be repeated at dinner. What Bayerlein did not say, because it required no saying, was that this was the expected outcome. American military culture was a subject that had been analyzed thoroughly by German intelligence throughout the 1930s. The conclusions had been consistent and, in the opinion of most senior Wehrmacht officers, obvious. America was a nation that had not fought a major war in a generation. Its army was small, underfunded, and organized along doctrinal lines that reflected the thinking of the previous century. Its officer corps was drawn largely from men whose primary qualification was their attendance at West Point, an institution that German military analysts considered competent but provincial, producing soldiers who understood regulations better than they understood battle. More fundamentally, America was a democracy, and democracies produced a certain kind of soldier. Not a bad soldier necessarily, but a soldier who had grown up in a culture that valued individual comfort, who had been raised to question authority, who understood the purpose of an institution only as it related to his personal advancement. Such men could be brave. History demonstrated that clearly enough. But bravery was not the same as discipline. And discipline was not the same as the particular combination of initiative and obedience that German military culture had spent decades cultivating. By 10 in the morning, the breakthrough was complete. American units were in full retreat across a front of nearly 30 kilometers. Equipment was being abandoned, vehicles left running with their engines still warm. Bayerline's driver, a young Bavarian named Holtzmann, who had the habit of singing quietly to himself during artillery barrages, navigated their vehicle through a landscape littered with the debris of a disintegrating army. Crates of rations, a field kitchen still attached to its towing vehicle, abandoned at the side of the road. Personal items scattered across the sand, the small archaeology of panic. At the village of Spatla, they passed through what had been an American supply depot. The storage tents were still standing. Inside them, Bayerline walked through rows of carefully organized equipment. American field rations, far more varied and caloric than anything the Africa Corps had seen in months. Replacement parts for vehicles and radios, sorted by category and labeled in the American fashion, with an almost domestic neatness that struck him as faintly absurd in the context of what surrounded it. Medical supplies, in quantities that seemed excessive until you understood that this was simply the American approach. More of everything. Always more. He picked up a small cardboard box, turned it over in his hands, read the English lettering without comprehension, and set it down. They bring their entire country with them, he said to no one in particular. He did not yet understand what he meant by this. He would, in time, understand it completely. But on the morning of February 14, 1943, standing in an abandoned American supply depot with the sounds of his panzers moving through the pass behind him, Fritz Bayerlein understood only that the Americans had been beaten, that they had been beaten decisively, and that this confirmed everything he had believed about them. He was right about the defeat. He was catastrophically wrong about what it meant. 6 weeks is not a long time. In 6 weeks, a child does not learn to walk. A language cannot be mastered. A wound of any seriousness does not fully heal. By the standards of human transformation, 6 weeks is barely a beginning. But on the morning of March 23, 1943, as the tanks of the 10th Panzer Division rolled out of the mountain pass above the El Guitar Valley, Fritz Bayerlein began to understand that 6 weeks could, under the right circumstances, be an eternity. The attack began well. It always began well. 50 German tanks emerged from the pass in the early morning light and descended toward what their commanders expected to be another American position ripe for collapse. The 10th Panzer was one of the finest armored formations in the Wehrmacht. Its crews had learned their trade in the hardest school on earth. When they moved with the efficiency of men who had done this before. In Poland, in France, in the vast emptiness of the Russian steppe. It stopped looking routine at approximately 9:30 in the morning. The minefield came first. 8 tanks destroyed in less than 4 minutes. Tracks blown apart by mines laid with a precision that spoke of careful preparation rather than hasty improvisation. Then the artillery began. And this artillery was nothing like what Bayerlein had witnessed at Kasserine. He turned to his adjutant Kessler, who stood beside him studying the impact patterns with an expression Bayerlein had not seen since the first winter in Russia. "How many batteries?" Bayerlein asked. "At least 4, Kessler said quietly. "They are firing time on target." Time on target. Every artillerist understood the concept. You calculated the flight time of each shell from each battery and adjusted firing time so that all rounds arrived simultaneously. The effect was devastating precisely because it eliminated warning. With sequential artillery, an experienced soldier heard the first shells and moved. With time on target, there was no first shell. There was only everything at once. 6 weeks earlier, at Kasserine, American artillery had been a different instrument entirely. Shells falling on empty ground, batteries firing without coordination, forward observers unable to reach their gun lines through static-filled radios. He had watched German tanks move freely through gaps that American guns should have closed. Something had changed. Not only the equipment, something more fundamental. By noon, the 10th Panzer had lost 30 tanks and was withdrawing toward the pass. Bayerlein spent the afternoon writing his assessment for Rommel's headquarters in the careful language of professional military analysis. He wrote that American artillery coordination had shown marked improvement. He wrote that their defensive preparation had been of a quality not previously encountered in this theater. He did not write what he was actually thinking. What he was thinking was more disturbing than any tactical setback. At Kasserine, the Americans had made every mistake available to them. Dysfunctional command, absent coordination, paralysis in the face of unexpected pressure. These were the mistakes of an institution that had not yet learned how to fight. He had seen similar mistakes in the early weeks of Barbarossa, but the Soviets had required 2 years and millions of dead to correct them. The Americans had apparently required 6 weeks. Someone had looked at Kasserine without flinching, understood precisely what had gone wrong, and fixed it. He did not yet know about Patton taking command on March 6th. He did not know about the observer teams that had descended on surviving units within days of the defeat, asking hard questions and writing down every answer. He knew only the result. He looked out across the valley where his tanks were still burning in the afternoon light. Smoke rose in black columns against the pale Tunisian sky. "They learn," he said quietly, to no one in particular. It was not a compliment, but it was something more honest than contempt. On a table in a requisitioned farmhouse outside Palermo in the summer of 1943, a German signals officer named Major Heinz Lorenz carefully disassembled an American radio. The farmhouse smelled of dried figs and old stone. Outside, cicadas produced their relentless Sicilian noise. Inside, Lorenz worked in silence, his tools arranged with the neat precision of a man who had studied electrical engineering at the Technical University of Berlin and had spent 3 years maintaining Wehrmacht communications equipment across 2 continents. He knew radios the way a surgeon knows anatomy, not as objects, but as systems, each component meaningful only in its relationship to everything surrounding it. The radio on his table was designated SCR-300 by the Americans. It had been recovered from an abandoned jeep near Gela, intact and undamaged, which was fortunate, and also, Lorenz suspected, slightly intentional on the part of whoever had left it. Americans did not typically abandon functioning equipment without reason. He lifted the main chassis from its olive drab casing and held it under the lamp. 18 miniature vacuum tubes. He counted them twice, not because he had miscounted, but because the number seemed wrong. 18 tubes in a package that a single soldier could carry on his back, that weighed perhaps 17 kilograms fully loaded with battery, that could reportedly transmit voice communications over a distance of 13 kilometers across open terrain? The closest German equivalent, the Torn.fu.D2, required 2 men to carry, one for the transceiver, one for the battery and power supply, connected by a cable that battlefield experience had proven was approximately as durable as a promise. Lorenz had personally witnessed, on 3 separate occasions in North Africa, the results of that cable being severed by shrapnel. 2 soldiers, each carrying half a radio, neither able to communicate with anyone. He set the chassis down and picked up his notebook. The American tubes were the first revelation. They were miniature in a way that German military tubes were not. Not because German engineers lacked the capability to produce small tubes, but because the German military had never required it. Wehrmacht radios were designed for vehicles or fixed positions. The requirement to make a radio small enough for one man to carry into combat had simply not been a German priority. And priorities shaped industries in ways that were nearly impossible to reverse quickly. These American tubes had been developed for civilian portable radios. Lorenz understood this immediately. The tolerances, the design philosophy, the particular way the components were arranged. It all spoke of an industry that had spent decades solving the problem of miniaturization, because American consumers had wanted radios they could carry to the beach, to the park, to the summer houses that apparently every American family possessed. The Wehrmacht had inherited its electronics industry from a culture that made radios for living rooms. The Americans had made radios for everywhere, and when war came, everywhere had included the infantry company. But the tubes were only the beginning. What Lorenz found as he worked deeper into the chassis was more unsettling. The SCR 300 used frequency modulation, FM. He had known this from the technical documents that German intelligence had compiled, but knowing it abstractly and holding the physical evidence in his hands were different experiences. FM meant that the radio was immune, or nearly immune, to the electrical interference that plagued every AM set on a modern battlefield. Tank engines, artillery explosions, aircraft ignition systems, all of these generated electromagnetic noise that corrupted amplitude-modulated signals. An AM radio operator near a tank engine was effectively death. An FM operator heard voices with the clarity of a telephone conversation. Lorenz set down his tools and sat back in his chair. He had spent 3 years watching German infantry lose contact with their supporting arms at precisely the moments when contact mattered most. He had read the after-action reports, written in the careful, passive voice of officers who understood that identifying a systemic failure too directly was professionally dangerous. Radio contact lost due to atmospheric conditions, communication interrupted by mechanical failure, coordination impeded by terrain. What those reports had not said, because saying it would have required acknowledging a choice made years earlier by men still in positions of authority, was that German radios failed in combat conditions because German radios used amplitude modulation. And amplitude modulation was fundamentally incompatible with the electromagnetic environment of a modern battlefield. The Americans had understood this in 1938. A colonel named Colton at Fort Monmouth had made the decision that all future American military radios would use FM, and the American industrial system had executed that decision with a thoroughness that Lorenz, sitting in a Sicilian farmhouse surrounded by the wreckage of a failed German defense, found difficult to contemplate without a particular feeling he identified, after a moment, as professional grief. He closed his notebook and looked at the disassembled radio on the table. Outside, the cicadas continued their noise, indifferent to the significance of what lay on the table before him. First Lieutenant David Mercer was 21 years old and had been in Europe for 11 weeks when he called in the artillery strike that destroyed a German tank column outside Troina. He was crouching behind a stone wall, his SCR 300 on his back, binoculars pressed against his face. The wall smelled of old mortar and goat. 4 kilometers behind him, 3 batteries of 105mm howitzers were waiting. He keyed his handset. Steel 6, this is forward 2. Grid 447312. Column of armor, 9 vehicles, moving northeast. Request battalion fire, over. The response came back in 3 seconds. Clear and unbroken, despite a German tank engine idling less than 300 meters away. 47 seconds later, the first ranging round struck the road. He adjusted, transmitted the correction, and then the world in front of him came apart in simultaneous explosions that turned the road into something unrecognizable. From first transmission to final adjustment, less than 4 minutes. General Major Friedrich von Broich received the report of the Troina column's destruction that evening. He set it beside 3 similar reports from the preceding 48 hours. 4 armored columns, 31 vehicles, all destroyed by American artillery directed by forward observers with portable radios. Von Broich had commanded armor since Poland. He understood artillery as both weapon and constraint. German artillery was excellent, accurate, well-served, technically sophisticated, but it operated through a command philosophy that reflected where decisions should be made. Requests traveled up through battalion, to regiment, to division. The process was deliberate, and under stable conditions, effective. Under stable conditions. What the Americans had built was architecturally different. Their fire direction centers received coordinates from forward observers and calculated solutions for multiple batteries simultaneously, compressing what German procedure required 20 minutes to accomplish into something closer to 3. Von Broek did the arithmetic he had been avoiding. A German company commander who spotted enemy armor sent a runner to battalion. 5 minutes, assuming the runner survived. Battalion forwarded the request to artillery. Another 5 minutes. Shells landed 15 minutes after the sighting. The target had moved. An American company commander spoke into a radio. 4 minutes later, the target ceased to exist. The difference was not courage, not tactical intelligence. It was a box weighing 17 kilograms, built on frequency modulation and 18 miniature vacuum tubes developed for civilian portable radios, manufactured by an industry that had spent 30 years making electronics smaller because American consumers had demanded it. What made the situation irreversible was scale. American factories were producing SCR 300 units by the tens of thousands. Crystal production alone had reached 30 million units annually. Quartz crystals that gave American radios their frequency stability. A figure Germany could not approach, having been cut off from Brazilian quartz deposits by Allied naval blockade since 1942. At Normandy, Allied planners allocated 90,000 transmitters for the invasion, operating simultaneously across 50 kilometers of coastline. In the first 3 weeks after the landings, signals recorded approximately 80 interference complaints among all transmitters. 80 among 90,000 radios. Von Broek had none of this information in the summer of 1943. He had only the reports on his table and the arithmetic they implied. Somewhere in the hills above Troina, a 21-year-old was crouching behind a stone wall with a radio on his back, connected in 3 seconds of clear transmission to enough artillery to end a conversation permanently. Not the howitzers, not the shells. The weapon was the voice. The voice that traveled without static through battlefield noise, made possible by an inventor named Armstrong, who had given his patents to the War Department and asked nothing in return. Von Broek looked out through the window at the Sicilian darkness. Somewhere out there, the Americans were talking to each other. Chapter 3. The Learning Machine. Part 1. On July 14, 1944, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley stood in a Norman field and watched a Sherman tank drive through a hedgerow. Not over it, through it. The hedgerow, a compacted earthen wall 4 feet high and 3 feet thick, overgrown with centuries of root systems, had stopped American armor for 6 weeks. The bocage landscape of Normandy was a medieval fortress without walls, every field its own defensive position, every gap between fields a killing ground, covered by German machine guns and Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets. Between certain villages, American forces had suffered approximately 1,000 casualties for every kilometer of advance. At that rate, the war would last another decade. The tank that Bradley watched carried 4 steel prongs welded to its front hull, fabricated from scrap steel salvaged from German beach obstacles. When the driver accelerated into the hedgerow, the prongs bit into the earthen wall, pinned the tank's belly down, and the Sherman crashed through in a shower of dirt and roots, emerging on the other side with its guns level and ready. Bradley turned to his chief of staff. "How long to equip the entire First Army?" 11 days, sir, if we start tonight." Bradley said nothing for a moment. Then, "Start tonight." The man who had built the device was Sergeant Curtis Cullen from Cranford, New Jersey. He was not an engineer. He had no formal technical training. Before the war, he had worked an ordinary job in an ordinary town and had given no particular indication that he possessed the kind of practical genius that changes the outcome of campaigns. What he possessed was something the American Army had been systematically cultivating since Kasserine: the institutional permission to solve problems without waiting for permission. The original idea had come from an even more unlikely source. A Tennessee private named Roberts had mentioned during a discussion about the bocage problem that the tanks ought to have saw teeth on their fronts, like a saw cutting through wood. The other soldiers had laughed. Cullen had not laughed. He had gone to a field repair depot, found the German steel obstacles that the engineers had cleared from the beaches, and begun welding. Oberst Werner Mertens, commanding a regiment of the 2nd Panzer Division 12 kilometers away, learned about the device on July 26th, the day after Operation Cobra began. He learned about it from the sound of American armor moving through positions his commanders had considered impassable. Mertens had spent 22 years in the Wehrmacht and its predecessor institutions. He had studied at the Kriegsakademie, had written papers on armored doctrine, had been present at the development of the operational concepts that had made Germany the most feared military power in Europe. He understood, at a level of genuine professional depth, what made armies effective. What he could not understand, what no amount of Kriegsakademie training had prepared him for, was the speed at which the American Army converted a private's offhand suggestion into a strategic capability deployed across an entire army in 11 days. In the German system, a sergeant did not solve divisional problems. Problems of that magnitude were referred upward to officers, then to engineers, then to committees, then back to officers for approval. The process was thorough, professionally rigorous, and utterly incompatible with the pace at which the American Army was now operating. He wrote in his diary that evening, "The Americans do not fight the way we were taught an army fights. They fight the way water moves, finding every crack, filling every space, never stopping because one path is blocked." He had meant it as criticism. Reading it again the following morning, he was not certain it was. What Mertens was observing had a name, though he did not know it. The United States Army had built a feedback system unlike anything in military history. Observer teams moved through combat units collecting lessons learned. Training bulletins disseminated successful innovations within weeks. Replacement training in the United States was continuously adjusted based on frontline reports, expanded from 8 weeks to 17 as combat experience revealed that rushed preparation produced unnecessary casualties, then compressed again when the Bulge crisis demanded immediate reinforcement. Each adjustment reflected actual combat experience, not peacetime theory. The contrast with German practice was not subtle. Wehrmacht units hoarded successful tactics locally. Officers who reported failures risked their careers. The institutional reflex was concealment rather than analysis, and concealment meant that the same mistakes were made repeatedly, by units that had no access to the lessons paid for in blood, by units that had gone before them. Mertens closed his diary and listened to the sound of American armor in the darkness beyond his perimeter. They were still moving. They were always still moving. Oberfeldwebel Karl Brandt had fought the British for 2 years before he met the Americans. He had fought them at Tobruk, at Alamein, in Tunisia. The British were, in his considered opinion, the most professionally competent soldiers he had ever faced. Their logistics were reliable. Their artillery preparation was thorough. Their infantry moved with disciplined economy that reflected decades of institutional experience. Fighting them was like playing chess against a grand master. You always knew roughly what was coming, but knowing did not make it easier to stop. He met the Americans in the hedgerows of Normandy in July of 1944, and within 72 hours had revised every assumption he carried from North Africa. The British, he wrote in a letter to his brother that was never sent, fight like professionals. The Americans fight like they are angry about something. The incident that crystallized his thinking occurred outside a village whose name he never learned to pronounce. His platoon held a farmhouse at the edge of a field, a solid defensive position with good sightlines and a stone wall that would stop anything short of a direct artillery hit. By every conventional measure, it required a coordinated company-level assault to dislodge. What came instead was a single American squad, 8 men, who had apparently decided that waiting for coordination was an inefficient use of their afternoon. 2 men laid down fire from a hedgerow gap. 3 moved across open ground in short rushes. The remaining 3 used a radio that produced, 90 seconds later, 4 mortar rounds landing with precision that suggested exact coordinates rather than a general area. Brandt's position became untenable in 4 minutes. He withdrew with 5 of his 8 men. Afterward, reconstructing the engagement with the analytical habit of a long-surviving soldier, he identified what had disturbed him most. Not the aggression, not the firepower. It was the absence of hesitation. The British soldier was trained to a standard and fought to that standard. He was reliable precisely because he was predictable. A German NCO with sufficient experience could anticipate British responses and plan accordingly. The American squad had not consulted established procedure. They had looked at the problem, invented a solution, and executed it before anyone with authority to approve had been informed. The private who moved across open ground had not done so because his sergeant ordered him forward. He had done so because he identified the correct moment and moved. This was not individual recklessness. Individual recklessness he had seen in every army, and it got men killed without consequence. What he witnessed was something systematic. An institution that had trained its soldiers not only in what to do, but in how to think. That had cultivated initiative at the lowest levels as deliberate philosophy rather than occasional accident. He wrote in the unsent letter, "Fighting the British, I always knew the next move. Fighting the Americans, there is no next move. There is only what they decide to do, which is never what you expect." General-Lieutenant Bayerlein arrived in Normandy in June of 1944, commanding Panzer Lehr Division. He brought with him the assessment refined since El Guitar, through Sicily, through the grinding retreat up Italy. In the Bocage fighting of July, Panzer Lehr was systematically destroyed. Not in a single catastrophic engagement, but in the accumulated arithmetic of 100 small actions, in which American forces absorbed casualties, identified what had gone wrong, adjusted, and returned. The division that had entered Normandy at full strength was, by late July, a formation in name only. Bayerlein filed his after-action report with careful precision. He noted American improvements in combined arms coordination. He noted artillery effectiveness. He noted, with the economy of a man choosing words for superiors who did not want to hear them, that American tactical flexibility had reached a level presenting difficulties not previously encountered. What he did not write was simpler. They had been amateurs. They had decided to stop. And the most frightening thing about them was not their firepower or their numbers. It was that they were still learning. On the morning of December 22, 1944, Lieutenant Helmut Henke was given the most unusual assignment of his military career. He was to deliver an ultimatum to the Americans. Henke was 26 years old, a staff officer with the 47th Panzer Corps, fluent in English, possessed of the kind of careful manners that his superiors considered appropriate for diplomatic communication. He had been chosen for this mission because he looked trustworthy, which was, he reflected, a quality of uncertain value when walking toward enemy lines under a white flag. The situation at Bastogne was, by any objective measure, desperate for the Americans. The 101st Airborne Division and elements of the 10th Armored had been encircled since December 20th. They lacked adequate winter clothing. Artillery ammunition was critically short. The wounded could not be evacuated. 7 German divisions surrounded the town, and the weather that grounded Allied air support showed no sign of breaking. German Corps Commander General Heinrich von Luttwitz had composed the ultimatum personally. It was, Henke thought, a reasonable document. It acknowledged the courage of the defenders. It offered honorable surrender terms. It warned, with the measured language of professional military communication, that continued resistance would result in the annihilation of the garrison and unnecessary suffering for the civilian population. Henke and 3 accompanying soldiers approached the American perimeter at approximately noon, white flag raised, and were met by soldiers who blindfolded them and led them to a command post. He delivered the ultimatum and waited. What came back was a single sheet of paper. He unfolded it, read it, read it again, then looked up at the American colonel standing across the table with an expression of careful neutrality. The paper contained one word: nuts. Henke's English was excellent, but this particular usage gave him pause. He asked, with the diplomatic precision his assignment required, whether this response was favorable or unfavorable. Colonel Joseph Harper looked at him for a moment. Then he explained, in language that required no translation, that it meant the same as telling them to go to hell. Henke walked back toward German lines with a single-page response in his coat pocket, and the particular feeling of a man who has delivered a message to the wrong address. He had expected calculation, exhaustion perhaps, the rational assessment of an encircled force weighing survival against honor. He had not expected one word. What Henke did not know, could not have known from his position outside the perimeter, was that inside Bastogne, the response had required almost no deliberation. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting division commander, had read the ultimatum, crumpled it, tossed it toward a wastebasket, and said one dismissive word before returning to the operational maps on his table. His staff had drafted the formal reply only because protocol required a written response. The word was not bravado. It was not performance for the benefit of subordinates who needed inspiration. It was the genuine reflex of a man who had not considered surrender as a category of available options. This distinction mattered enormously, and it was the distinction that German commanders from Bayerlein to von Lüttwitz kept encountering without fully understanding. The British soldier fought professionally, which meant he fought within a framework of rational calculation that included at its outer edges the possibility of surrender when resistance became tactically pointless. This was not cowardice. It was the logic of an institution that valued its soldiers and understood that dead men could not fight tomorrow. The Americans operated from a different framework entirely. Not an irrational one. Bastogne was eventually relieved, the calculation proved correct, but one in which the emotional relationship between a soldier and his mission produced responses that professional military logic did not predict. Henke filed his report that evening. He described the exchange accurately, including the English colloquialism and its translation. He noted that the American commander had responded without apparent deliberation. He did not speculate about what this meant. That was not his assignment. But walking back through the frozen Belgian forest with one word in his pocket, he had felt something that his report did not capture. Not admiration exactly. Something closer to the feeling a chess player gets when his opponent makes a move that exists outside the logic of the game he thought they were playing. The prisoner spoke without being asked. Unteroffizier Georg Steiner had been captured outside Bastogne on December 24th, taken by a patrol of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment during a night action that he described, in the careful understatement of a man still processing shock, as not going according to plan. He sat in a heated room in a requisitioned Belgian farmhouse, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that an American private had placed before him without comment, and talked. The American intelligence officer, Captain Robert Aldis, let him talk. He had learned, in 4 months of frontline service, that prisoners who wanted to speak were more valuable than prisoners who required persuasion. Steiner was 23 years old, a veteran of the Eastern Front, and he had something specific he needed to say. "We were told," Steiner said in the careful English he had learned at gymnasium, "that the Americans would break, that encirclement would produce panic, that they were not soldiers in the serious sense." Aldis wrote this down without expression. "Who told you this?" "Everyone," Steiner said. "It was the general understanding." The general understanding had roots that ran deeper than propaganda. German military culture had developed, over decades of professional refinement, a coherent theory of what made soldiers effective. Discipline, obedience, the subordination of individual judgment to institutional hierarchy. These qualities produced the tactical excellence that had carried German arms across Europe, and they produced, as a secondary effect, a particular blindness. An army built on obedience struggled to model an army built on initiative. German officers analyzing American behavior consistently interpreted American informality as indiscipline, American flexibility as lack of training, American willingness to improvise as evidence of doctrinal immaturity. They were not wrong about what they observed. They were wrong about what it meant. Steiner had fought the Soviets for 14 months before transfer to the Western Front. He had his own comparison to offer, unprompted. The Russians do not break either, he said. But with the Russians, you understand why. They are afraid of what is behind them as much as what is in front. He paused, looking at the coffee. The Americans are not afraid of anything behind them. They stay because they want to stay. This is a different problem. Aldous looked up from his notes. Different how? Steiner considered this with the seriousness of a man giving an honest answer to a question that mattered. With the Russians, you could calculate the limit. Enough pressure, enough casualties, the calculation changed. With the Americans, he stopped. At Bastogne, they were encircled, undersupplied, outnumbered. Every professional consideration pointed one direction. They answered with one word. He shook his head slowly. You cannot calculate the limit of a man who does not believe a limit exists. Captain Aldous included Steiner's observation in his interrogation report, which traveled up through intelligence channels and eventually reached the collection of prisoner assessments that American analysts were assembling into a portrait of German psychological deterioration. The report was accurate but incomplete, as all reports were. What it captured was the symptom. What it missed was the cause. The Americans who held Bastogne were not superhuman. They were cold, undersupplied, and genuinely uncertain whether relief would arrive in time. They had fears and doubts in the normal human quantities. What they possessed, in addition to these ordinary vulnerabilities, was an institutional culture that had never seriously presented surrender as a framework for thinking. The British Army was old enough to have absorbed, across centuries of imperial campaigning, a pragmatic wisdom about the limits of resistance. There were situations in which surrender was the professional choice, and the institution acknowledged this without shame. It was the wisdom of an army that had learned, in 100 colonial campaigns, that dead soldiers accomplished nothing. The American army was young enough, and shaped by a national mythology sufficiently absolute, that this particular wisdom had not yet been incorporated. Whether this was a strength or a limitation depended entirely on the situation. At Bastogne, in December of 1944, it was the difference between a held perimeter and a collapsed one. Steiner finished his coffee. Outside, artillery rumbled in the direction of the German lines, Patton's Third Army grinding northward through the frozen Ardennes toward the encircled town. They are coming to relieve them, Steiner said. It was not a question. Yes, Aldous said. Steiner nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something he had already understood. Of course they are, he said. In March of 1950, General Albert Proun sat down at a desk in a quiet room in Neustadt and began to write. The Americans who had arranged this wanted a report on German radio intelligence, its methods, its capabilities, its failures. They were building something, Proun understood, some institutional architecture of the coming Cold War, and they wanted to know what the Wehrmacht had learned about communications in 6 years of the most technically demanding conflict in human history. Proun was 56 years old. He had survived the war, the purges following the July 20th plot, and unconditional surrender. He had watched 2 predecessors, Felgebel and Fila, hanged with piano wire at Plötzensee prison for involvement in the assassination attempt against Hitler. He had inherited their office on November 1st, 1944, and served until the final collapse. He had nothing left to protect. He wrote honestly. The report ran to 250 pages. Chapter 4, Section 3, was devoted specifically to American radio communications. The structural choice was itself significant. Of everything the Wehrmacht had faced, American communications technology represented the failure Proun considered most consequential and least understood by the men who had made the decisions that produced it. He began with the SCR-300. German signals units had captured examples in Italy in the autumn of 1943, analyzed them, and produced accurate assessments. The SCR-300 was superior to German equivalents in range, reliability, and noise immunity. Its frequency modulation gave it battlefield performance that German amplitude modulation equipment could not match. The assessments had been accurate. The response had been inadequate. Prown wrote this without euphemism. The Wehrmacht signals establishment had understood the problem and had not solved it. Partly for technical reasons, partly industrial, and partly because the command culture punished acknowledgement of deficiency more severely than the deficiency itself. To formally request resources for FM development in 1943 would have required formally acknowledging that German equipment was inferior. That acknowledgement carried professional risks that most officers had chosen not to accept. The Americans had made their FM decision in 1938. Colonel Colton at Fort Monmouth had understood what FM meant for battlefield communications and directed that all future American military radios would use frequency modulation. The decision had been controversial. Colton had overruled the objections. 5 years later, German signals officers in Sicily were disassembling captured SCR-300s and writing reports about the consequences of that decision. Prown wrote, "The American commitment to frequency modulation represented a strategic investment whose returns were collected on every battlefield where American and German forces met. The Wehrmacht possessed the technical knowledge to make a comparable commitment. It did not possess the institutional conditions necessary to act on that knowledge." What Prown was describing was the difference between two kinds of institutional failure. The German failure was well documented. A command culture that suppressed accurate information, punished honest assessment, and substituted ideological confidence for technical reality. The American near failure was less discussed. In 1942, the Signal Corps had very nearly gone to war with AM portable radios. It had required one engineer, Daniel Noble at Galvin Manufacturing, to object strenuously enough, and one colonel willing to listen for the decision to reverse. One conversation, one officer willing to hear an uncomfortable argument. Prown did not know this specific detail, but he understood its implications because he had spent 6 years watching what happened when institutions did not have that conversation. When the officer with doubts kept them to himself. When the engineer with the better solution was overruled by the procurement official with the established relationship. He gathered his pages, aligned their edges with the habit of a career spent in organized institutions, and set them down. Outside, an ordinary German morning continued. The war was 5 years distant, and somehow also permanent. Living in the precise measurements of the report before him, range figures, frequency specifications, production numbers. The arithmetic of a defeat assembled into 250 pages that nobody with the authority to prevent it would ever read. The factory on West Augusta Boulevard in Chicago was quiet by 1946. Not abandoned. Galvin Manufacturing had survived the war and would survive the peace, eventually becoming Motorola, one of the giants of American electronics. But the particular intensity of the war years had dissipated, the way fever breaks, leaving behind something cooler and more ordinary. Henrik Magnuski walked the production floor on a Tuesday morning in February, past machinery retooled for civilian work, past workers who had no idea that the man moving quietly among them held 3 patents on a device that had helped determine the outcome of the largest war in human history. He was 34 years old. He would never return to Poland. The Soviets who had replaced the Nazis had constructed something that bore his homeland's name and almost nothing else. His family had survived, but survival and return were different categories, and the government in Warsaw had made clear that men with his profile, educated in the West, employed by American corporations, were not welcome in the new order. He stopped beside a workbench and picked up a component, turned it in his hands without seeing it. 3,000 kilometers east, Oberfeldwebel Karl Brandt was learning to walk again on a leg reconstructed by an American military surgeon. He spent his afternoons in a chair by the window, watching the Frankfurt street below with the evaluative habit of a man who had spent years assessing terrain. He thought often about the Americans, not with bitterness. Bitterness required a conviction that things should have gone differently, and Brandt had lost that conviction somewhere in the bocage of Normandy. What he felt was the residue of professional respect. The recognition, arrived at too late to be useful, that he had underestimated his opponent in ways that were systematic rather than accidental. The Wehrmacht had been, by most technical measures, the finest fighting force of its generation. Its tactical doctrine was sophisticated. Its soldiers were disciplined and experienced in ways the Americans of 1942 simply were not. None of it had been sufficient. The Wehrmacht had been built to fight the war it expected. The Americans had built something different. Not an army optimized for a specific conflict, but a system capable of learning its way toward competence in whatever conflict it encountered. The difference was invisible at the beginning. It became visible, at enormous cost, over time. He thought about the squad that had taken his farmhouse in 4 minutes. 8 men, a radio, and the institutional permission to solve problems without waiting for permission. You could not defeat that with doctrine. You could only become it, or lose. Edwin Armstrong did not live to see the full legacy of what he had built. In January of 1954, Armstrong dressed carefully in his Manhattan apartment, wrote a letter to his wife, and stepped from his 13th floor window. The legal battles with RCA had consumed his fortune and his health. The technology that had given American soldiers clear voice communications through the noise of artillery and tank engines had made his enemies wealthy and left him broken. His wife Marion eventually won settlements exceeding $10 million from 21 infringement suits. The confirmation arrived too late. Magnuski learned of Armstrong's death through a brief notice in an engineering journal. He set it down and sat for a moment in the silence of a man receiving news that is not surprising and is nonetheless a blow. Armstrong had given his patents to the War Department without compensation, had asked nothing in return. The War Department had accepted. The corporations had taken what followed. Magnuski returned to his work. There was nothing else to do. The SCR 300 sets that survived the war ended up in various places. A few were acquired by collectors who understood what they were looking at, not merely obsolete equipment, but the physical residue of a moment when the right technology, produced by the right industry, wielded by soldiers who had learned fast enough, had intersected with history at the correct angle. The vacuum tubes still glowed when power was applied. Warm orange light in the dim interiors. The same light that had burned in shell craters and jungle clearings across 6 years of war. Wars are not won only by courage. They are won by the quiet work of engineers in ordinary factories, by inventors who give everything and receive nothing, by institutions willing to hear the uncomfortable argument from the person with the lower rank. The factory on Augusta Boulevard is gone. Fort Monmouth is closed. The men are dead. The lesson is not.